Spiritual maturity requires that at some point you and I begin to thank God for the limitations that are caused by weakness. That's a startling statement, so let me say it one more time. Spiritual maturity requires that at some point we begin to thank God for the limitations that are caused by our weaknesses. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, the Apostle Paul illustrates this very well in his description of a thorn in the flesh that God had given to him. In verse 7 it says, "Lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me," he says, "lest I should be exalted above measure." That thorn in the flesh has caused great discussion through the years. Some have suggested that it was his eyesight. Some have suggested that it was his stature, and perhaps a physical malady that created a hunched-over position. Some have even suggested that the thorn in the flesh was actually the people at the church at Corinth. But today, I am very thankful for the lack of specificity that God gives to this thorn in the flesh. His lack of giving a very specific description of what it is allows for a broad application for all of us in the many things that limit us and create weakness in our life. Now, there may not be a specific title to this thorn of the flesh, but this verse does give an indication to a couple of things. It does appear to have a physical element to it. He says it was a thorn in the flesh. There also appears to be a spiritual element to it when he says that it was sent by a messenger of Satan. Now, in all of that, he also says that there was a particular purpose to it. So this thing that has a physical element, a spiritual element, had a very spiritual purpose to it. At the very beginning of verse 7, he says, "And lest I should be exalted." And then at the very end of the verse, he says it again, "Lest I should be exalted above measure." And in the margin of my Bible, I put a little phrase that may be helpful for you to put, and that is the idea that this thorn is not prescriptive, but preventative. This God-ordained, God-assigned thorn in the flesh was not something that God put into Paul's life to fix something or to chastise him for something, but rather to prevent him from becoming a very proud, exalted man. There are so many things that God does in our life that aren't necessarily to judge us or to fix us, but really to prevent us from getting to a place where we displease God or a place where we don't believe that we need God. God gave Paul a thorn in the flesh. Now, we still hunger and we clamor for some kind of definition of this thorn in the flesh that we can actually sink our teeth into, and I think we have an answer to it. At the end of verse 9, when he says this, "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me." And then again in verse 10, he's going to reference this weakness. He says, "For when I am weak, then am I strong." I really believe we could, just to give definition to this thorn of flesh that applies to so many of us, it was the thing that God ordained in Paul's life that created weakness. I'm speaking today to a lot of people who feel weak. You feel weak in your physical strength. You feel weak in your spiritual strength. And that weakness creates limitations. And that passage is exactly for you and exactly for me. And one of the things I'm also thankful for in this passage is that when the Apostle Paul prays that this thorn in the flesh would be removed, God doesn't rebuke Paul. There is no rebuke that Paul had the nerve to ask for this thing to be removed. Now that aside, we do find, though, that Paul only prays 3 times for this thing to be removed. He says in verse 8, "For this thing I besought the Lord thrice," or 3 times, "that it might depart from me." I take great comfort in that today, that when I also pray, "Lord, would you take this thing out of my life?" the Lord doesn't rebuke me for praying that way. It is a very human response to these weaknesses, but God doesn't rebuke us for that. I am very thankful for that, and I hope you are too. But here's the thing that intrigues me, and I pose it now as a question. Why did Paul only pray 3 times? Why not 5 times? Why not 10 times? Why not 100 or 1,000 times? Why only 3? Well, the text says that God did answer him. God didn't answer him in the way that he asked for. The Lord says, "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." So God chose not to remove the thorn, but did give him grace. And after 3 times of praying for the thorn to be removed, Paul stops. To which I again ask the question, why only 3 times? Here's the answer I've been pondering, and I want you to ponder it as well. I believe Paul stopped at 3 times because it was at 3 times that he began to believe that God's answer to not remove the weakness, but to give grace, was a better answer than the thing that Paul was asking for. Now, that causes us to sit back and think. And one of the things that it causes us to think about is, just how powerful is grace? If God offers grace but doesn't remove the thorn in the flesh, and Paul was content with that answer, just what exactly is grace and how powerful is it? Well, let's allow the text to define grace when it says, "For my strength is made perfect in weakness." I believe the Lord's statement right there gives us a working definition for the kind of grace that God offers to us in our weakness. It is strength in weakness. Now here's what I find is common in my life. Let's picture this table, God on the other side, I'm on this side, and I'm praying. And I'm praying that the Lord would take this thorn in the flesh and remove it. And so I slide it across the table and I say, "Lord, would you take this thing away?" And from the Lord's side of the table, He pushes it back and He says, "No, you're going to keep the thorn in the flesh, but I'm going to give you grace." I look at that and I say, "That's not what I asked for. I asked that you would remove this thing." And the Lord pushes it back across the table and He says, "No, I want you to keep that, but I'm going to give you grace." And that back and forth across the table of prayer that happens in so many of our lives is largely due to the fact that we just don't realize how powerful and how valuable the grace that God offers really is. Now, to put some teeth again to this grace, would you note 3 things? 3 things that God's strength in the form of grace enables us to do. Number 1, it enabled Paul to be content with God's answer, though it was different than what he had asked for. The very fact that he was able to stop at 3 requests is an evidence of the kind of strength that God gave to Paul to be content with an answer that was different than he asked for. That's a really powerful strength. And when you and I humble ourselves and we accept the grace of God in the thorns that He has placed in our life, His grace gives an ability to be content, even if God's will is different than what I've been asking for. You see a second evidence of this strength when Paul later on in the chapter says in verse 15, "And I will very gladly spend and be spent for you, though the more abundantly I love you, the less I be loved." Here we see that God gave him a strength in the form of grace to love people, even when they didn't love him back. Sometimes when I'm interacting with people, I hear and discern that some of the thorns that God has placed in their life are thorns related to people. Sometimes a person has a spouse who's very ill, and that illness in the spouse weakens the other. Sometimes it's the spiritual things that God is doing in a spouse or a child that weakens the parent or weakens the spouse. And if we're not careful, we can begin to look at those people who God is using to weaken us and in a sense, they become the enemy. They become the target of our despising. We want them to change. We want them to go away. But God gives a grace. He gives strength to love those very people and to spend and to be spent again and again and again for them, even if I don't get anything back in return. The third strength you find in this form of grace is found in a word and a series of thoughts that just kind of surface through this chapter. So for instance, in verse 9, he says, most gladly, therefore will I rather glory in my infirmities. Verse 10, he says, therefore I take pleasure. Verse 15, and I will very gladly be spent. Here's the strength we see. God gave Paul grace that produced strength to be joyful in circumstances that weren't the kind of circumstances he would have chosen. He goes so far as to say, I rather glory in my infirmities. In other words, he had come to a place in his spiritual maturity where he was thanking God for the limitations caused by the weaknesses God had given him, because that then became the conduit, the portal for God to give grace. That leads and leaves us with this final question: how in the world do I get that grace? And 1 Peter 5 suggests that that kind of grace comes to the person who is humble. God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace to the humble. And in that humility, it's not just that we think little of ourselves. In fact, you and I interact through society with all kinds of people who think lowly of themselves, but just thinking little of ourselves isn't humility. Rather, it's thinking right about ourselves in light of our big view of God. Humility is thinking big of God, and then in turn thinking correctly about ourselves. And one of the things that these God-ordained weaknesses do is they elevate our view of God and they clarify our view of ourselves so that we can be humble, receive the grace of God. And here's what I love. God says that that grace is sufficient. I'm not sure what kind of God-ordained weaknesses you have in your life these days, but here's what I do know. Humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, and you will find the grace of God, strength in weakness. That is the kind of strength that enables you to say, you know what? I am thankful for the weakness and the limitations ordained by God.